Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Metropolitan Republican Club's webinar series. My name is Krisha Lenzo, and on behalf of the Met Club board, we're excited to have you join us this evening. As a reminder, we have a donation link in our live chat, and we hope you'll consider making a contribution to help support the club during this 2020 election cycle. Tonight, I'd like to introduce Joel Pollak, Senior Editor-at-Large at Breitbart News, in-house counsel at Breitbart, and host of Breitbart News Sunday edition on SiriusXM. Joel is the author of several books, including How Trump Won, The Inside Story of a Revolution, and author of a new book, Red November. Will the country vote red for Trump or red for socialism? We hope the former. He is also the winner of the Robert Novak Journalism Alumni Fellowship and is a graduate of Harvard College and of Harvard Law School. Tonight, we will focus our conversation about his time covering the 2020 election cycle and what we should expect in the head-to-head Trump-Biden matchup. So without further ado, welcome Joel.
Thanks for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I think I was last with the West Side Republicans back in January, at the beginning of the year, with Ellen Dershowitz, and we had a packed house somewhere, I believe on the Upper West Side or somewhere, and it was a lot of fun. And who knew what the year had in store? It's been an incredible ride since then. And a lot of people are curious about how November is going to turn out, obviously, and what's going to happen after the election as the parties start lawyering up and gearing up for the legal fights that follow. But my feeling right now is that President Trump is in a position where he has a chance to win. And that's all you can really do as a Republican. The way our media work and the way our politics follow the media, there's no real way for a Republican to win an important race unless it's by surprise. If you think about the last several Republican presidential elections, they've all been won against the run of expectations, whether it was the 2000 recount or 2004 when the networks declared John Kerry had won on election night, to, of course, 2016 when pretty much everybody expected Trump to lose. Surprise is how Republicans win elections, because the media wouldn't be the media that they are, the fake news media, if they didn't set the expectation that Democrats would win. They do this to encourage Democrats to vote. And all Trump can really do is to be in a position to win. And that's what he's done. He's put himself in a position to win. There's a great article in The Nation, a periodical of note on the left today, by Jeet Heer, who's their national affairs correspondent. And he wrote about how the Biden Republicans that Democrats had hoped for, the people who were going to defect from the Republican Party and come over and vote for Joe Biden, seem not to exist. And that's not to say there's nobody in the Republican Party, nobody on the right who doesn't like Donald Trump. We know that there are never Trump Republicans who are quite vocal, especially in Washington and New York and media circles and so forth. There are very few of them, but they're quite voluble. We know they exist, but as a political force, essentially they have vanished. And the analysis in The Nation on the left was that Democrats mismanaged their convention in a very specific way. They tried to pitch their convention to some extent, especially on the first night, to Republicans who are wavering in their support for Donald Trump. And they brought out John Kasich, and they brought out all kinds of other people to make the pitch, make the case that Donald Trump is unfit for office and Joe Biden is such a wonderful guy, nice guy and everything. Well, Donald Trump came out and made a much stronger pitch to patriotism and made a pitch for law and order, which is becoming much more compelling for Republicans than what Democrats offered. And the point the Nation writer was making was, we shouldn't have sidelined Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We shouldn't have sidelined all of our young progressive voices in favor of these old, stodgy Republicans who don't like Trump because he's upset the establishment. That was a losing message. The Republicans did better in their convention. And now all these Biden Republicans are consolidating behind Trump, while Democrats have failed to expand beyond their base. I think that's actually an accurate assessment, an unusual moment of honesty from someone who's a partisan on the left. And, you know, you see those kinds of essays at Breitbart too, and people at Breitbart want to remind the conservatives all the ways in which they or we are failing. I'm in these editorial discussions all the time. We have these debates internally, but Breitbart's been fairly sharply critical of Republicans and even of President Trump when we feel that they've strayed from a conservative agenda or that they're going down the wrong path. I've been pretty vocal about the need for a healthcare policy and so forth. So this is the kind of constructive criticism you rarely see, but you do see among partisan media sources, openly partisan media sources like Breitbart or The Nation. I think that's correct. I think Trump is in a position to win. The convention was very successful. Biden has completely mismanaged the unrest. The Oregonian, which is the local paper in Oregon, came out with a report about a poll that had been done recently in Oregon. Now, Oregon, remember, has voted Democrat for the last umpteen years. And while the poll showed strong disapproval of President Trump, he has higher positive approval in the state than any of the state's Democratic elected leaders, including the governor and the mayor of Portland, Ted Wheeler. And the majority of Oregonians believe that the protests in Portland were not peaceful, that they were violent, and that the word riot should be used. The majority said the word riot should be used rather than protest. And that's in Oregon. That tells you that Democrats mismanaged their message very, very badly. And they had opportunities to get it right, but they didn't say anything about the unrest in their convention. And then the following week, during the Republican convention, the violence erupted in Kenosha, in Wisconsin, which is not even in the top 100, big cities in the United States. I mean, it's a city, it's a small city just across the Illinois border. If you drive from Chicago to Milwaukee, you go right through it. And the Biden campaign came out with a statement on the Monday morning after the incident happened with Jacob Blake that triggered rioting the night before. And Biden blamed the police. And he said this was about systemic racism, which is the Democrats' campaign message. And he said nothing about the riots and nothing about the violence and nothing at all about peaceful protest. He just expressed outrage. Well, there were more riots that night. There were more riots the following night, and there was violence, there was shooting. And only then, 3 days after the riots had started, did Biden come out with a statement condemning the riots. But then he compounded the mistake by saying he wasn't going to travel to Kenosha, and his campaign strategically leaked. They thought this was a good idea. They strategically leaked to Politico that they expected the Trump visit to Kenosha, which was going to happen on the following day, to backfire. That Trump was going to go to Kenosha and he would be seen as the instigator of the violence, and therefore it would be a disaster for the Trump campaign. Well, Trump went there. He was welcomed with open arms by the business owners and by law enforcement. There were some local Democratic leaders who stayed away, the mayor stayed away and so forth. But anybody in a position of authority to deal with the unrest was deeply grateful, publicly grateful to the president. And then Biden suddenly said, oh, wait, I got to go to Kenosha. I'm going to Kenosha. So it's been that pattern for the last 2 or 3 weeks where Trump has done something and Biden has been playing catch up. Today, Biden held a huge press conference about the vaccine, and he was briefed by a team of experts about the vaccine. Well, who is this team of experts? It's the same people who have been briefing him about everything related to health policy. It's Ezekiel Emanuel, the architect of Obamacare, and so forth. And they gave Biden advice about the vaccine. And now he wants to talk about the vaccine. And he doesn't like Trump's vaccine, but he wants to talk about vaccine therapies, et cetera. And it's this kind of Me Too campaign, pun intended, because of course Biden's faced some of these Me Too allegations that have disappeared from the media. But just to give you a sense of where the race is, this is anybody's race to win. And right now, my feeling is that the Trump campaign is doing more of what it needs to do to win than the Biden campaign is doing. The Biden campaign is gearing up, and they're going to put up a hell of a fight. They're going to have the media support, the support of the tech companies, Hollywood, everything. But I think that the Trump campaign is doing now what it needs to do to have a chance of winning in November. And remember, that's the best any Republican can hope for, a chance of winning, because it's very rare that you're going to see a Republican running away with the race. It can happen. The race could really change even further in the next couple of weeks, especially with the debate coming up on the 29th. But I think that right now, the president has just got to stick to his plan, and he'll be very competitive on November 3rd.
Well, thank you. That was a great synopsis, placing us where we are right now in terms of the election cycle and looking forward to the debate on the 29th, as you mentioned. Let's talk a little bit about the debates. What do you think we should expect from the Biden-Harris campaign, or today, as Joe Biden said, the Harris-Biden campaign?
Right.
What do we expect from their team? Is it going to just be all scripted? How is this going to work?
Keep in mind the expectations are vastly different for both sides. So the Biden campaign has been downplaying expectations, and so has the Trump campaign. They've been saying that Biden can't make it through a debate without the assistance of drugs. Trump's been joking about having a drug test, And the danger with that is that Biden will win the debate by standing up for 2 hours. If he can simply stand there, then the media will declare him the winner. What's interesting to me is that Trump is playing his cards very close to his chest. It was leaked to possibly Politico also a couple weeks ago that Trump hasn't done any debate preparation. And I don't know if that's true. I doubt it's true, but it could be true. He certainly goes to all these town halls and faces questions from reporters. So he's definitely in the groove of rapid fire questioning and so forth. And I think George Stephanopoulos last night on ABC, who was quite a hostile moderator, was actually a good warm up for Chris Wallace on 29th September, because Chris Wallace is also going to be a hostile moderator, even though he works for Fox.
Right.
But Chris Wallace will probably be hostile to Biden as well. Remember, Biden has refused to go on Wallace's program on Fox News Sunday. So I think it's going to be quite fiery and feisty. You'll hear Wallace fact check the candidates in real time. And I think that's what the media is looking for. They want to see a moderator that fact checks Trump, and he's going to try to do it. I don't think that's going to work for the audience, because people have the sense that the media only fact checks things when it wants to state an opinion about something. And so I think Wallace is almost certain to be, as we say, cruising for a bruising. I mean, he's going to get criticized harshly by everybody. I don't know that the first debate's going to settle anything. I think the Biden campaign strategy is to do one debate, show that it can be done, and then say they can't do more debates. I think that's actually the ideal Biden strategy. And I think Trump's strategy has to be to take the audience by surprise. It's very hard to do that when you're Donald Trump, and there are so many surprises you've thrown out there already. But if I had to make one prediction, I think that you would see on night one of the debate a calm and reasoned Donald Trump, which is what nobody expects. I think everybody expects him to go in there, guns blazing, fists flying, and just pound the sand out of Joe Biden. And I think it's going to be the opposite. I think Trump is going to walk in there and he's going to shock everybody with a statesman-like, not low energy, but a solid performance. And Biden, if you remember, the one debate he won on the national stage was against Paul Ryan in 2012. On substance, Paul Ryan won. If you were scoring the match on points the way we do in boxing, or we used to do this in boxing when people still boxed, Ryan would have won on points, but Biden won on a knockout, because Biden just threw his hands up in the air, made all these clownish gestures, and rolled his eyes and grinned and did all these stagey things that let the audience at home know that he had contempt for Paul Ryan. And some of that evokes the same feeling in the viewer. It's a stage trick, and Biden was actually very good at it. I don't think he could do it anymore. He really has declined physically and mentally. I don't think it's not media bias on my part from a conservative perspective to say that. I think it's just obvious. But I think that he may try some of those tricks with Trump, and I think Trump has to just stay solid. And the left will be very excited by anything Biden does. If it's a walking stage, I don't think it will be for the first debate, but if Biden tries to impose physically in some way, I think they'll find that very exciting. But I think Trump is going to try to change people's expectations and make the case for another two debates. I think if the more he brings Biden back, the better Trump looks.
So what happens after the debates? We're 50 or 40 some odd days until the election. What happens with the mail-in ballots? Are we going to be expected to put up a good legal fight against the Democrats? I mean, given your legal background, what do you think? Is this going to end up in the Supreme Court?
The really interesting thing is if it ends up in the House of Representatives. I don't know that the Supreme Court is where this ends up going, because obviously you have to have a particular controversy for it to make it to the Supreme Court, right? So it'll be some sort of legal fight in one state or another, maybe several states. But the states have such different systems. It's hard to imagine the Supreme Court bunching all of these in sort of one case. Who knows? I do think you'll see lawsuits. The lawsuits will be expedited, but not all of the legal issues will be settled. Remember, in New York, it took 6 weeks to count the ballots in one of the Democratic primary races in just one congressional district. So it doesn't matter how quickly the court takes some of these cases up as they arise, the counting may not be done. So where I think things may end up is in the House of Representatives. And I think that if Biden or Trump don't win in a landslide, then I think you're going to end up in the House of Representatives. Now, people might think that favors Nancy Pelosi. It would if every member had a vote. But the Constitution says in the 12th Amendment that specifically when it comes to the issue of electing a president, the votes go by state in the House of Representatives. So we only have 50 votes in the House of Representatives, and the majority is necessary to elect a president. It just so happens, I've done the math, I've looked through all the state delegations, Republicans control the majority in 26 states, even though overall within the House of Representatives, Republicans are in the minority. So Republicans, if all the Republican states voted for Trump, they could push Trump through to re-election in the House just on the basis of their own majority, the 26 majority they have, 26-seat majority they have. The Democrats have 23 seats, and Michigan is a 7-7 split. So what's interesting is Pelosi and the Democrats could try to deny a quorum of representatives. Procedurally, I'm not up on all the details of how this works. It could be that the vote is taken by the next Congress instead of this Congress. My assumption has been that since the vote has to be taken by the House immediately, and since the most recent example we have of this is in 1824 with the election of John Quincy Adams, that happened before the new Congress, I believe. I think it happened in February 1825. And in those days, I don't think the president was sworn in until March. And I'm not sure. I think Congress similarly was later in the year. So I think it was the former Congress that decided things. In any case, it's going to be a mess. I think that's where the fight's going to happen. And there could be any number of outcomes once it goes to the House of Representatives. All of this is different if there's a landslide. If Trump wins by, 80 electoral votes on election night, it's going to be very hard for Democrats to say that this should have gone the other way. Now, is he likely to win by a landslide? I don't know. Is Biden likely to win by a landslide? I also don't know. Well, let me just say this. I don't think Biden has a good chance of winning by a landslide anymore. I think that was a possibility earlier in the summer. I think that the Democrat support for the Black Lives Matter movement, for their support for protests against police, defunding police, reimagining police, that's the talk word, that's the talking point they use. I think all of that has dented Biden's ability to win in a landslide. So I think Biden can win in a narrow election. I think Trump could also win in a narrow election, but I think there's also the potential for surprise. There are these little polls like Oregon that are showing Trump picking up support, or at least developing the potential for support in places where he normally wouldn't be competitive. And while everyone's attention is on Wisconsin and Minnesota and so forth, there may be other states where the events of the last 6 months have been so dramatic that the electorate has changed in ways we don't yet understand. And Oregon, again, just because of the news today, but Oregon is really interesting. I'm not saying that they shift the focus of the race to Oregon, but Oregon has some very deeply conservative rural areas. And if people, even in Oregon, think that Black Lives Matter has been a disaster, you might see a protest vote cast in Oregon. And they're used to voting by mail. They always vote by mail. So vote by mail there would actually go pretty well because they've been doing it for decades. I think that you could see Trump picking up support, whether he wins. It's again doubtful, but it's possible. And if you see that happen, then I think you could see a Trump landslide. That would spare the country the ordeal of going through whatever Democrats have planned for after November 3rd.
And what about the House of Representatives? Do you think there is a viable chance for the Republicans to flip the House and oust Crazy Nancy, as Jim Cramer called her to her face?
I do. I think that everywhere that you find a competitive race this year, the Republicans are running with momentum. Republicans know why they're running. They also feel confident. When I talk to candidates, when I look at races, I see Republicans who feel that they have their opponents on the defensive. Black Lives Matter, remember, has frightened people in the suburbs. And most of the districts that Democrats won in 2018 are suburban districts. They are terrified of the defund the police movement. They don't feel they got anything out of Nancy Pelosi except impeachment. Most of these representatives went to Washington to do something. They had the March for Our Lives, the gun control initiatives. They wanted to do something about climate change. Maybe they wanted to invest in infrastructure, whatever it was. They got nothing done except impeaching the president. And impeachment was very unpopular in many of those districts. Now you come to them and say, we want to defund the police. It's a disaster for Democrats. There's not one thing they can run on except hatred of Donald Trump. Now, there are a lot of people who hate Donald Trump. They might turn out and vote against him. That might be enough for Democrats to retain the House. But just from the sense I get from the few races I'm following, Republicans feel like they're in a very strong position. Now, of course, it depends on candidates as well. There are some candidates on the Democratic side that are very, very good. And that's going to be a challenge for Republicans in some of these places. But likewise, on the Republican side, you have some incredible candidates. There's one guy running in Oregon. He is one of the 3 Americans who stopped the terror attack on the train in Europe a few years ago. Alex Scarlato is his name. And I think he's running in the 5th district. He's running against Fazio, is that his name? Anyway, but Alex Scarlato is the name of the guy. And he was also in the movie 1517 to Paris, made by Clint Eastwood.
Right.
And he's a very high caliber candidate. He's a veteran. and a really well-spoken guy. And of course, international hero. He won France's highest decoration for valor for stopping the terror attack with the other two Americans. So, that's a candidate running on the Republican side. So Republicans have picked up some good candidates as well.
So the last question for me, and it's more of a personal question about your trajectory and your background with respect to initially being more liberal and then working with Andrew Breitbart, and your change in philosophy. As this is happening to many right now, people are changing sides. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you started off writing in Ralph Nader even on the ballot?
My flirtation with the Naderite left. Yeah, when I was in college, I was very much on the left. And I think it comes out of growing up with the belief that every generation has the opportunity to change the world. And when you get to college and you look around, the people talking about changing the world are all on the left. And they have big plans. And you're young and impatient and you want to learn about how to change the world. And these people are highly accomplished. They're professors. They've written books. They're very interesting. Some of them are very charismatic. And I was very drawn to the classes of Cornel West at Harvard. I took 2 classes with Cornel West. And I got very involved in left-wing political movements and so forth. And you think there really is something to this idea of changing the world. You want to learn how people did it. You want to learn how people are going to do it in the future. And I was a true believer. And I began to have my doubts over time, even while I was in college. But my real education came in South Africa, where I was actually born. So my family comes from South Africa. I was born in Johannesburg. I grew up in Chicago. And my siblings are both born in the United States. But I went back to South Africa as a Rotary Scholar, and I was very interested at that point in the post-apartheid government, which was doing a lot of the left-wing things that I thought the United States should do. And because I was a true believer, I put myself in situations where I was trying to observe on the ground how this great social change was happening. And what I learned was quite shocking, which is that the government often was making things worse. And education is a great example, because in the name of affirmative action and representativity, the idea that an institution should represent the demographics of the country as a whole, they offered a lot of the white teachers in the public school system early retirement. And the result was that the best teachers, and the system just happened to be that those were the best teachers. It was a racist system, so the white teachers were the better teachers. They all left. And so as a result, the black students coming into these schools got a worse education after apartheid than they would have had before apartheid was over. And it was just one example of that. But one after another of these cases where the redistributionist impulse, the impulse of racial justice and social justice, hurt the people it was supposed to benefit. And I got a real insight into that when I was there. I worked there. I got a job as a speechwriter in the South African Parliament, working for the sort of center-left opposition there, the Democratic Alliance. And I learned a lot there because I was getting right up and close to the political debate there, learning a lot about public policy there that I probably wouldn't have learned if I'd just been reading the newspaper. And it really changed my perspective. And when I came back to the United States 7 years later, and I went to law school, I realized I wasn't a Democrat anymore. In my mind, I hadn't quite made that shift, but after about a semester of law school, I realized that I was a Republican, and all the things I'd been taught about Republicans, that they were racist and sexist and greedy and all that, I just said, well, you know what? I'm none of those things. I just happen to believe what the Republican Party seems to believe, and so I'll just go with the flow. And at that point, I was confident enough to say, people can say whatever they want to say. They can imagine whatever beliefs I have in my head, but I actually have experience that's informed my change of heart. And I think it's not necessarily uncommon. People become more conservative as they enter the real world, as they grow up and so forth. What struck me at my 10th reunion, when I went back to college, and I've been now to my 20th reunion, so we're talking about a little while ago. But what struck me was I had totally changed in my thinking, and many of my classmates had not. Despite 9/11, which had happened right after we graduated, despite all that stuff, a lot of people hadn't changed their views. And in general, and I'm generalizing, I don't think those people were as engaged. They weren't following the issues as closely. Being left-wing was more of a posture. It offered a kind of psychological benefit. It wasn't really a way of engaging in politics. It was more a way of claiming a certain status or a certain perspective. And one final observation about this, I often tell young people when they ask me how they can win the battle on campus, what I tell them is, you may not win the argument that moment. You may not win someone over right away. But at that 10th reunion, I went up to people I remembered from college who I had late night debates with, discussions in dorm rooms or apartments or whatever. And I said, you remember that argument we had 10 years ago or 11 years ago when you were trying to hit on that girl and we stayed up all night talking about states rights versus federal policy. You were right about that. I thought about it for 10 years, and actually you were right about it. And often they didn't remember it. Like, what are you talking about? But in my mind, it really stuck there. I think you'll find when people are really conscientious and they take an interest, they're going to mull over some of what you tell them. So you may not win the argument right away, but if you've at least exposed somebody to a different way of looking at things, the thoughtful people will find that hard to forget.
Yeah, that's a great point. So now we're going to turn it over to our audience questions. We have a lot coming in. Someone writes, as a Californian, it was good to read your latest piece on Darrell Issa's opponent and how he, like Nancy Pelosi, are unable to accept and applaud the Abraham Accords. Can you expand on the mindset and also what's happening in that particular race?
That race is interesting. It's an open seat. The 50th District of California. It used to be held by Duncan Hunter, who had to resign because he was charged with corruption, campaign spending violations, and he got sentenced to 11 months in prison. Very sad. He was, Marine and all that. And his father had been the congressman in the district before him. In any case, he was facing off against a guy in the last election named Amar Kampa-Najjar. Amar Kampa-Najjar is a young, very handsome Democrat, served for a brief period of time in a communications role in the Obama administration in one or two of the departments there. And he was actually born in the district. His mother is Mexican, his father is Palestinian, and actually his grandfather is one of the Palestinians who was involved in planning the 1972 Munich massacre at the Olympics in Germany, when Israeli athletes, I think it was 11 Israeli athletes, were murdered. And his grandfather was killed by Israeli commandos in a raid in 1973 in Beirut. And the leader of that mission was a guy named Ehud Barak, who then went on to become Israel's prime minister. So this was a part of his past that had sort of been buried. It came out early in the 2018 race in one of his interviews, and he disavowed his grandfather's actions. But, I did a lot of the reporting and digging on that story, and it turned out he had once called his grandfather a legend. His father was a senior Palestine Liberation Organization official. So all this stuff came out in the last election, and it hurt him. He almost beat Duncan Hunter, but he fell just short. Well, he's running again. Darrell Issa, who used to represent a nearby district, the 49th, which has become very liberal, retired in 2018 and is now running in that open seat. He won the primary, and he's running against this Palestinian Mexican-American Democrat. And Darrell Issa should do very well, and he's very well funded. The problem he faces is that people see him as an outsider who isn't from the district, and he was also very critical of Trump in 2016. And so a lot of what Kampa-Najjar, the Democrat, is doing is reminding these voters that the Republican in the race was anti-Trump. So he's actually quite a good campaigner. But the article I wrote today was about how he had not said anything publicly supporting the Abraham Accords, which is interesting to me because he had been quite careful about a year ago, 2 years ago, to talk about how he was in favor of peace between Palestinians and Israelis. And with his background, he really needs to be, he needs to be out there. And he was quiet. He didn't say anything about it. And after I published the article, he sent me a bunch of statements. Oh, no, I'll say this and I'll say that. So I included them because I want to be fair to him. I don't think he opposes peace, but I think he's definitely been confused about it, as many Democrats have. Democrats are dealing with cognitive dissonance right now. Trump wasn't supposed to be able to do this. Not only wasn't he supposed to be able to create peace in the Middle East, he wasn't supposed to be presidential in any way. What are these foreign leaders doing up there thanking him for anything? Exchanging pens and pieces of paper. I mean, this is not supposed to happen. So I think they're all just kind of putting their hands over their ears and wishing it goes away. And I think you're seeing that a lot in many of the Democratic districts. And I think Republicans actually have a very strong case to make here that Democrats are not supporting peace. And groups like J Street, which is a left-wing organization which purports to be in favor of peace, I mean, they were very skeptical of this, pouring scorn all over it until the last few days before the ceremony when they kind of changed their minds. I mean, Democrats really hoped this didn't happen, not because they're bad people who oppose peace, but just because they couldn't imagine Trump doing it. And it does, in a sense, cement Trump's legacy, whether he wins or not. So that's the state of the race there. We'll be watching it very closely in the 50th district. I think as voters tune in, Issa is going to do better because this fellow Kampa-Najjar, although he's painting himself as kind of a conservative Democrat, really isn't.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think even CNN, liberal media in general, was just focused on social distancing. They couldn't it really pained them to write the lower thirds of what was being shown on TV, I'm sure.
Yeah, the social distancing. I mean, Trump didn't shake any hands. I thought I'm a person who thinks that social distancing is important, and I like it when the president shows that he's participating in that. And he did. He didn't. There were no big handshake moments. You think Camp David Accords, Oslo Accords, the big handshakes that happened. There were no big handshakes. The president just put his hand on his heart like that, and that was it. And I thought that was fine. I mean, he gets credit for nothing and blamed for everything.
Exactly. Okay, the next question. The deep state seems intent on doing everything and anything to stop the president, including trying to convince us that the president disparaged our U.S. military. At this point, what cards are left for the deep state to play? That's a good one.
They have no more cards. They're out of cards. And you can see it because the officials who came out and supported this Atlantic story, for example, wouldn't go on the record. And it's essentially the same story we've heard thousands of times before. I mean, the proof of this Atlantic story was something that President Trump said publicly about John McCain 5 years ago. I mean, that was supposed to tie it all together. So they don't have inside information anymore. And with Bill Barr running the Department of Justice, it's very hard for them to run their own investigations. They can't go rogue, as maybe some of them were inclined to do under Comey, or maybe not so rogue. He may have supported them. We still don't know enough about that. But one thing I can tell you is this. If Trump loses, we're not going to find out what happened in 2016. If Trump loses the election, the new Biden administration is going to kill those investigations, kill those prosecutions. They're going to say it was all political, it never had any merit, that these were legitimate investigations into Russia collusion, and that's the end of that. The Durham probe will be over. There'll be no more Inspector General reports about what happened. And if they do have an Inspector General report, it'll be buried in some congressional hearing, and that'll be the end of that. So if you really want to find out what happened in 2016, and I think there's a strong national interest in finding out, because we've only delayed this far because of Democratic opposition and stonewalling by the agencies, but it really is important to know whether there was an internal effort by the law enforcement and intelligence agencies of this country to prevent a democratic election and a democratic transfer of power. That's very, very, very important to know. And it should be something everybody is interested in knowing, but we won't find out if Biden wins.
Can you talk, as a journalist, I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about the anonymous sourcing in the Atlantic piece and why it's so problematic? Even though people at Fox, were really, really gung-ho about saying that they stood by their story. Can you explain why there's many problems with it?
Well, the problem with anonymous sourcing is it's very hard for anybody else to check your work. So why do scientists have peer review? Scientists publish in peer-reviewed journals so that anyone who wants to repeat their experiments can do it themselves and come to the same result. And the problem with journalism is that the peer review is now out the window, because journalism has become so lax in its standards that with anonymous sources, you can get away with anything. Nobody can go to the same people and say, did you actually say this? Or can you back this up? The Fox effort to confirm the story suffered the same problems. You had one of their correspondents saying on Twitter, mind you, not on television. She said on Twitter that she had confirmed the allegations in the story with 2 anonymous sources. And then she went through and there was a Twitter thread of all the things she confirmed. But she didn't confirm the central allegation. And when she went on TV and talked to Bret Baier about it, he asked her about that allegation. And she said, well, no, that's not confirmed, but I confirmed all this other stuff. And she hadn't actually confirmed some of that other stuff. It was just her reading the article to somebody and that person saying, yeah, it sounds like something Trump would say. So Fox News, I think, is actually having a broader problem with their viewership and readership, that they're sort of fair and balanced, right? They're not supposed to take a side, but their viewership and readership has trusted them to at least present the Republican or conservative side fairly. And there are enough anchors who feel troubled by Donald Trump's presidency in one way or another for whatever reason, that they often don't give him a fair shake. And I think this is one of those cases. I don't think the fact that they reported that they had confirmed some of the story changed anyone's mind, because again, the central allegation hadn't been confirmed and had been refuted by John Bolton, who, until a couple of weeks ago was national hero for the same people. So I don't think that story really goes anywhere. And the other thing about it is you see the extraordinary effort that Trump makes for veterans, for people serving in active duty. I mean, I watched his ceremony this week when he gave medals to the California National Guard out here, who flew helicopter missions to rescue hundreds and hundreds of people who were on their summer vacation, like last holiday, and they got trapped by this fire that came out of nowhere where they were. And they were told, these hikers and vacationers were told that they probably couldn't get rescued and they'd have to try to jump in the lake, literally jump in the lake, because that might be the only place to save yourself. And these crews, these helicopter crews from the California Army Air National Guard, they went out there and they did several missions rescuing hundreds of people at great risk to themselves. And you watch that ceremony with a lump in your throat and you realize that, the president took the time to honor these people. I mean, this is a president who actually has a connection and a bond with the rank and file of the military. I don't know about the officer corps, but certainly with the enlisted ranks, there's a great degree of affinity between the enlisted men and women of the armed forces and the president.
So next question. As the left would say, how are things looking for the GOP with the Latinx community? How effectively did the Democrats appeal to the American Hispanics during the Democratic primaries?
So Latinx is an interesting term. I know you're saying that in jest, but I want to point out, in case you're not aware, something like 2% of Latinos use that term. It's mostly a term used by the white woke left. There was a poll that came out recently.
No surprises there.
What's that?
No surprises there that they're the ones.
Yeah. Well, Latinx, I mean, it's not even a Spanish word. I mean, it's a made up American word. Look, Spanish is a Romance language. It has gender. Nouns have genders. How are you going to rewrite the entire language? Does a table decide what gender it is when it gets older? Anyway, that's a side note. But Democrats are having trouble with Hispanic voters. Now, that's one of these weird surprises that could happen in this election. You wouldn't think that Democrats would have trouble with Hispanic voters because, after all, President Trump came to office promising to build the wall, to end illegal immigration, no more amnesty. He said that Mexico wasn't sending its best people, and so on and so forth. Kids in cages and all that, even though Obama and Biden put the kids in cages. But, this was supposed to be the president who was going to just bomb out with Latino voters. This was going to be a generational shift, this election, toward the Democrats, because Latino voters were going to vote for whoever the Democratic nominee was, and they would be forever cemented to the Democrats after the Democrats passed amnesty. Now, that could happen if the Democrats passed amnesty. That could still happen. If Democrats win, and Chuck Schumer has said amnesty is number one on his agenda, if they legalize 11 million new voters, those voters are going to vote Democrat. But what's interesting is that there's been a huge shift among Latino voters. Part of that is Biden's weakness. So in the primary, Biden already had trouble with Latino voters. And for whatever reason, it could be, well, one of the reasons was that the activists, the left-wing activists who hate Trump, they were on the ground in early primary states campaigning against Joe Biden. And I stood with my feet freezing off my legs in Iowa outside the Democratic debate in mid-January, taping and interviewing these anti-Biden activists, many of whom were from Central America, undocumented immigrants and so forth. And they came out there saying, no more deportations, no more Joe Biden. I mean, literally, that's what they were saying. So there's an undercurrent of sort of left-wing opposition in the Hispanic community to Joe Biden. And I have the frostbite to prove it. But the other thing that happened more generally is this. Black Lives Matter is very unpopular among Hispanic voters to a degree I don't think we've properly measured yet. But the backlash in the Hispanic community against Black Lives Matter is probably as strong, if not stronger, than in a typical white community. In fact, the white community may be more supportive. But there was a very interesting moment early in the riots this summer. It was a conference call that leaked from Chicago. The mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, reform-minded African-American Democrat, was speaking to all 50 of the aldermen from Chicago. And one of her critics, who is from a Mexican neighborhood on the South Side, said, "You're not helping us. There's this rampage going through our neighborhood. We have people walking around on the street with AK-47s. Places are burned out. There are windows being smashed. Where are the National Guard? Why aren't you sending us anybody?" And she basically swore at him. She used some expletives, and he used some expletives back. But in that exchange, you see some of the tension that has developed in a lot of these urban communities, where Hispanic communities basically feel that they've been hung out to dry, that you've got this concern about racial profiling, which is seen rightly or wrongly as primarily an African-American concern, and everybody's pandering to that concern and defunding the police. But the Hispanic community feels incredibly vulnerable because the police are no longer able to protect them. Right. And when the police do get called out in the National Guard, they go downtown to Michigan Avenue in Chicago, or they go to Manhattan, or they go up here in California to the Pacific Palisades to protect the shopping malls. You know, they're not protecting the barrio. And so there's a huge backlash that I don't think we quite understand yet against defund the police and the Black Lives Matter movement. You've also got some other Hispanic communities. Again, it's a diverse community. I don't want to get in trouble like Joe Biden and say it's more diverse than the African American community, but people from different immigrant communities often see issues differently. The Venezuelan community does not like the Democrats. The Cuban community does not like the Democrats. The Puerto Rican community does like the Democrats, and that's why Joe Biden came out yesterday playing Despacito on his cell phone. But he's in big trouble with Cubans, Venezuelans, and interestingly enough, with Mexican Americans. So we'll see where all this goes. Who knows where it's going to end up? But Joe Biden, according to the latest poll, is losing Latinos in Florida. You don't want to lose Latinos anywhere, but Trump may have, amazingly, strength among Latino voters. Go figure.
No, that would definitely be interesting if that turns out to be the case for sure. So another question we have is, what would be, in your opinion, a comfortable Trump win? The Democrats wouldn't accept the 2016 result, and that was the largest GOP electoral win in decades. Yet he didn't win the popular vote, but our U.S. electoral system is our current system.
That's a great question. I hadn't thought about that. A comfortable Trump win. Well, I think it's safe to assume, of course, anything could happen. I think it's safe to assume he'll lose the popular vote, and he may lose it by a massive margin. So a lot of the polls you're seeing right now that show Biden up by sizable amounts, we don't know to trust any of these polls because people are afraid of talking to pollsters in a way they never have been before. But they could be right. It could be that Biden wins by a massive margin on the national level because the states that are most populous, which tend to be blue states, not all, of course, you have Texas and Florida, but New York, Illinois, Chicago, California, especially New York and California, those states may be even more anti-Trump in 2020 than they were in 2016, just because of population changes and the kinds of political fights that have gone on, Cuomo versus Trump, Newsom versus Trump. So I think you may see a more lopsided margin in those states. You'll see millions of votes added to Biden's column. But I also think you're going to see Trump doing very well in other parts of the country. So I think Trump could win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote again. I think a comfortable win for Trump would be taking some blue states off of the Democratic column that even they would have to acknowledge they lost. So it's possible Democrats pick up places like Arizona, which is affected not just by immigration, but also by migration, by the migration of people from blue states down to Arizona for retirement. And that certainly has changed the complexion of the state politically. But I think you could also see Republicans picking up votes in places that Democrats have taken for granted, not just Minnesota, which came awfully close to going for Trump last time, but places like Oregon. And you know what? I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit and say, I mean, anyone who watches this will automatically discount all the rest of my opinions because of this one statement. But Illinois may be in play. And I say that because Illinois is in such a shambles right now, so disgusted with their Democratic leadership on every level, the mayor, the governor, the prosecutors at the Cook County level with the Jussie Smollett hoax and all that stuff. There's just a general disgust right now in Illinois. And again, the media there are pretty much third world in their left-wing bias. But I don't know what's going to happen in Illinois. Kanye West tried and failed to get on the ballot there. That may be in a court challenge right now. I'm not sure. But Kanye West is from Illinois. Illinois, I mean, if Illinois shifts, people's hair is going to fall out. But it's not beyond the realm of possibility. I don't want to predict it because, again, I sound like a raving lunatic, and then you'll probably say he's way too optimistic about Trump's chances. But I'm just saying what a comfortable win would look like. You'd have to pick off Oregon, Illinois, Minnesota, or just come up with some surprises in other places where Democrats suddenly have to realize that this election was a bigger mandate for Trump than they realized. How likely is that? Again, not likely. I think we're in for a very, very tough fight, but it could happen.
I don't think it's so far-fetched, though, because if you think about local politics, even in New York, ultimately, after everything that happened, chose Giuliani after, terrible crime and situations like that. So it is possible to, at least on the local level, to flip some of these cities and, states where the riots and crises have happened. So
that is.
Okay, next question we have is BLM an unexpected Trojan horse for the Democrats? They thought they found their Tea Party, but now they see BLM as really an uncontrollable Pandora's box for them.
I don't think we know yet. And I think that Black Lives Matter is still going to be a formidable force for Democrats, even if they lose this election. I don't think Democrats are going to drop Black Lives Matter or that movement in general. I do think they're going to have a conversation about tactics if they lose. And looking back at the civil rights movement, when you look at people like John Lewis, who passed away, he was a very strident partisan in the last 10 years or so. So in a sense, that tarnished his legacy a little bit. But overall, his life is an exemplary one. And what he did was he trained to become a protester. These protests we see in the streets, they're just picking up people, random people driving to where the action is and then putting on a helmet and a gas mask and going and creating havoc. Well, that didn't fly in the civil rights movement. You had to be trained in nonviolence. They actually trained people on how to be successful protesters. And it didn't involve tactics designed to cause chaos. The tactics were designed to evoke empathy, to evoke sympathy from people watching on television, people looking on from the sidelines. And it worked because they were nonviolent. They perfected the tactic of nonviolence. That will always be available to Black Lives Matter should they choose to use it. And that would really be the winning move for them. If that happens, I think Democrats and their association with Black Lives Matter will be a positive one, and it'll be a weapon instead of a kind of Trojan horse, which is a good way of putting it. I do think, though, that if Trump wins the election, you may see Trump realigning the way that the Black community approaches politics also. Trump winning the election on the strength of support from Black voters, which could happen. I mean, he could swing enough Black voters to make a difference in some of these states, would change the nature of the relationship between the Black community and the Democratic Party. And I think that Trump winning would provide an opening for Republicans to present an alternative that if Democrats don't move fast enough, they will fail to compete with. So Trump can present a different way of talking about civil rights and doing things together about civil rights, a different way and a different approach that echoes the civil rights movement and makes Black Lives Matter look like a bad mistake.
Mm. Okay, a couple more questions for you. Any concerns about the future of Breitbart and other right-leaning sites if the left wins the election? And how, if so, will your site prepare for this possibility?
Well, I think we'll be fine. In fact, I think, weirdly, we'll be in a better position because we've always thrived on opposition. Mm. But I do think that there are other dangers to think about. And certainly the left will relish the opportunity to push us off of whatever platforms we're on. I think there's no holds barred. If we see that the Democrats win the election, they will do to Republicans, first of all, what they thought Donald Trump was going to do but didn't do. They're going to repress dissent. They're going to stifle conservative media. I mean, these are all possible things that could happen. So in a commercial sense, I actually think, we have an opportunity, but also we have massive, massive new challenges. The other thing that's interesting is that you finally have some scrutiny of these big media companies, big tech companies under the Trump administration. There may be some antitrust actions and so forth. If Trump loses, that all goes away, or at least it gets reshaped by Democrats in a way that suits their interests, rather than suiting the interests of consumers, who it really should benefit. So, yeah, I think conservative media is in trouble if Democrats win. Having said that, our own, all other things being equal, our fortunes don't depend on who's in power or not. In fact, opposition is quite good for business, but we are very concerned about the stances that Democrats have taken on the First Amendment. Ironically, right? Trump's supposed to be the enemy of the press. Right. We can't cover some of these Antifa rallies properly or Black Lives Matter rallies properly, and nor can anybody else, because when we show up there, our journalists get assaulted. Literally, that's what happens. And so when you wonder why Americans are sometimes unaware of the rioting that's going on, it's because the journalists avoid the rioting. And the reason they avoid the rioting is they get pummeled every time they show up there with a camera. So I do worry about it. And I also worry that the left in general has cultivated a contempt for the First Amendment values. And that is something that will continue under a Biden administration. Trump is at least pushing back with some of his fighting for free speech on campus and so forth.
Okay, last question. Do you have any thoughts on Matt Drudge turning his back on Trump and conservative principles?
So Matt Drudge is an interesting guy. I've only met him once, and he's very mysterious. But the one thing about Drudge that is a constant is he has always emphasized chaos. If you go to the Drudge report, the story is the same every day in a new and exciting way, but the story is always the world is exploding.
The world's coming to an end.
Yeah, the world's going to end tomorrow, and read about it here, and then read about it again tomorrow when it ends the next day. I mean, that's basically Drudge's formula. It's been a winning formula. Now, he has developed a conservative following for obvious reasons. He's the one who broke the Lewinsky scandal, and he has a skepticism of the mainstream media and the Democratic Party and so forth, or had a skepticism. But he is betting on chaos, and he knows that if Trump loses, there's more chaos. Chaos is his editorial line. It's in that sense nonpartisan. So I think that Breitbart and other openly conservative sites will probably become more important to a conservative audience, but I would not bet against Matt Drudge, at least in terms of his future commercial success. I mean, he's certainly one of the most powerful and successful people in media. It doesn't mean that the person he wants to win the election will win the election. You know, he's lost several, but I think that if you want to understand the direction he's moving in, I would just look at it as more of a continuity than a change. Drudge always votes for chaos.
Well, on that note, Joel, thank you so much for your valuable insights. This is such a great conversation, and much like your, days in college when you look back on a certain conversation, I'm sure in the future we'll look back on this and say, hey, that Breitbart guy knew what he was talking about, and gave some very valuable foresight.
Well, here's the book. This is Red November.
And I was just going to say, please check out his book, Red November, Will the Country Vote Red for Trump or Red for Socialism? It's a great deep dive into our current election cycle, and even, before then, leading up to it with the Democratic primaries, and before then, great, great valuable insights there as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I will be on Greg Gutfeld this weekend. I won't be live. We're pre-taping Friday, but I will be on that show. And to all those observing the Jewish New Year, Shana Tova, Happy New Year. And if you're not, or if you have a DVR, watch me on Greg Gutfeld.
Oh, that'd be great. I'm sure that'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Check it out. And I'll put in a plug. Next week, we have actually one of your former colleagues, Steve Bannon, is going to be talking with us. So,
that'll be fun.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that too.
All right.
Thank you, Joel, and talk to you soon. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in.
Thanks for the opportunity.